couple years ago, my little brother and I discovered a show called Millennium. And this obscure-ish sci-fi show was created by Chris Carter. And if you know who Chris Carter is, you know that he is the man behind X-Files, the big one, like the one that everybody's at least tertiarily heard of. So when I heard that there's another Chris Carter science fiction show that's in a similar sort of vein, similar sort of style, I was like, where do I sign? What I discovered, having gone through all 3 seasons, watched the crossover X-Files episode, which is the de facto ending, and did a little bit of reading up on the material. I did a little bit of discovery and research about the show and what happened behind the scenes, and wow, was it wild. It was not what I was expecting, and it was unfortunate that it missed the mark in a lot of ways. And I don't really fully understand why they made some of the decisions that they did. I'll get into it later on, but I have no idea why they made some of these decisions. It's baffling. It's there's a lot of writing staff crossover, and there's a lot of involvement by Chris Carter in this show, and yet it kind of sucks relative to X-Files. It's quite a letdown. So I want to talk about that. So while I respect the nostalgia, the overarching feel I got from the show can be boiled down into 2 major points: missed potential and just strange priorities. Or why is this here? What is this decision that's been made? Why are we doing this way? Or what is the benefit to doing it this way? The show wants to build itself lore and a strong world, but it can't seem to finish anything it starts or take advantage of the pieces that it does lay down. The Season 1 Millennium Group was an awesome concept that would have worked as it was presented in the first season. If they had left it how it was, it would have worked. And the change in Season 2 could have been an interesting thing too. Changing it in the way that they did between seasons could have been a neat idea. They both could have worked. There was potential in both ways of viewing the Millennium Group. But it leans so heavily on the Monster of the Week style of episode, and the bigger stories and character building is so sparse and non-impactful. I'll get more into that later. An episode where the main character gets injured or has a big change apart from the Season 2 ender. That's a whole different conversation. Stuff that should impact the status quo just sometimes doesn't. Stuff gets left behind or abandoned. It's potential that's sort of just left. I don't know why we introduced it if we weren't going to do anything with it. The change from Season 1 to Season 2 is dramatic. The loss of the original directors, or the changing hands from the original directors to the directors who took over after Season 2, we lost a lot of the style, the visual style that the first season had. And I'm not real sure why. Why did we change this? I wouldn't call it stellar. I wouldn't call the style in the first season perfect by any means, but I would say that it had an identity to some degree. It had that sort of 90s gritty, a little bit of realism, but it loses most of it. After Season 2, a lot of those visual flair, that stuff that kind of gave it its visual identity is lost. It's done. It's over. And I don't know what we gained from that. It's a strange decision. The second point is strange priorities. Why is this here? When someone shows you a piece of art or plays you a song that's clearly, it's dripping with emotion. It's so obvious that it's just dipped in meaning for the person who made it. But you have no idea of the context or the intent. You don't know what this thing is about. It's clearly about lost love, but who are they talking about? You have no idea. This show is screaming something at the audience. It has something to say, in the first season and in the second and third season. I have no idea what it is. And I only sort of discovered it after reading the wiki page and diving into some of the sources of the interviews and what the directors and the creators intended to do with the show. And that's not a good thing. You shouldn't have those kinds of questions when you're watching a show. You should, for the most part, be able to get the message of what they're trying to say, why they mean what they mean, and why they say what they say, and what are the big story ideas, what are the things that are happening in this show. One of my other major gripes is just outright abandoning things. There are certain aspects, there are certain science fiction concepts, even fantasy concepts, that are introduced in an episode, and you sort of get the idea that they either want to run with it, they want to do something with it, and in the episode they won't finish fleshing out whatever the concept is, or they'll just abandon it and they won't explain it. It won't have an obvious symbolic meaning, or if it does have a symbolic meaning, it's not well thought out, it's not well shown to you, so you have to kind of guess what they mean when they introduce something, and I have examples of this that I'll get into later. But it just leaves things on the table, and it just leaves things where they are and doesn't interact with them, and it's very strange. It's I don't know why we chose to do these things this way. The show will set stuff up and just never pay it off. It'll just leave it. It'll just forget about them. Forget about these plot points or these things, or it'll throw things away that are really fascinating, that could be cool to explore in the context of this world. And it's just a minefield of missed opportunities and strange priorities, and it's baffling. It really I understand why people didn't connect with it that well, and that why it is a very niche kind of concept. Why it's a niche kind of property now, because I had no nostalgia for it. I had no previous exposure. I literally knew that it was a show called Millennium, directed by Chris Carter. That's the only information I went into the show knowing. And yet still I had no idea what I had just watched when the show ended. So I want to go through episodes. I want to talk about some specific episodes that illustrate my 2 points. These are hand chosen to illustrate these two ideas. They're meant to show you how I came to these conclusions that I came to, along with some other miscellaneous things that I found and researched, things that I like, things that I want to talk about, good, bad, and otherwise. So we start in season 1. Right from the get-go, the pilot is just dripping with style. It's that mid-90s, not late 90s, mid-90s sort of gritty atmosphere. In fact, the first scene really sells a lot of the feel of the show. And what they introduced in that first episode, when I experienced it, it felt very much like, oh, so we're setting up a story about strange science fiction-y fantasy elements, where we're setting up a story that has to do with, strange codes and like ancient prophecy, and it has a very specific feel to it. And it's interesting because this show wants to tell you something. Like I mentioned, it wants to tell you something. It has something to say. But right out of the gate, I have no idea what it's trying to say. So if after your pilot, or your first couple episodes at the least, I have a general idea of what your show is trying to say, or trying to do at least, That's not a good sign. That's not. You don't want to be in that position. And it's interesting. I'll make this comparison later on in the video, but it reminds me a lot of the old sci-fi SYFY network show Eureka. That first episode had a lot of the same issues, where it spends the whole episode setting something up that, at least to me, seemed like it was going to be a series-long running arc, or something that was happening in the background while we were getting to know things in the foreground. And that is not the case. Eureka is a very different case study than Millennium, but they share a lot of parallels in my mind of how they went about approaching things. Continuing with season 1, we have The Well-Worn Lock, and this one is dark as hell, and it's about some pretty sensitive material, but it's executed with a fair amount of tact, and it's an excellent episode showcasing Catherine, Frank's wife in the show. And it's one of the few instances in the show where we actually get to follow her around and sort of see the world through her eyes and how she handles things. And it gives her some character in a way that she doesn't get a lot of in the show. And it's unfortunate because they have a wonderful cast and they don't seem to use them for very much. Catherine, the daughter, Laura, and to some extent Peter Watts are very underutilized in the show. They could do a lot more. They could be used a lot more, and I'll talk about specifically Jordan, the daughter, later on, because there's a lot of cool stuff that you could do with the dynamic later on in the show, but they don't do it. They don't take advantage of it. And in this episode, it's the same with Catherine. It's really cool to see her get to have more personality than just mom and wife character. Now, it's not that reductive, but it's missed potential. It's something that could have been really cool, that could have fully fleshed the world out more and fleshed out the character of Frank Black and all the things that happened to him happening to her. It could have been a lot stronger. And unfortunately, an episode like this really hammers that home, because it's only one of the 2 or 3 where she actually gets any major screen time. Force Majeure is another episode in season 1, and it features the ever lovely Brad Dourif. Anything that he's in is wonderful. He's a great villain. He's a great, strange, odd character archetype. He plays his roles so well. He chews the scenery in the best way. I just love this episode because Brad Dourif's in it. What happens in this episode goes nowhere. We set this thing up, and we go through this, and we go through that, and this is another, I'm going to probably end up saying this a lot, this is another perfect example of, you set this up, you could have paid it off later. We could have revisited this group, we could have revisited what they were doing. There's great potential in this episode, and it's really lost, and it's not taken advantage of. Walkabout is another season 1 episode that I found fascinating, absolutely fascinating, because I've watched enough science fiction TV and TV and stories in general. I've consumed enough of media to sort of have an idea of where stories will go after a certain point. There's tropes, there's things that are reused over and over from science fiction property to science fiction property. And this is one of those episodes that I genuinely didn't know where it was going to go. I had no idea where they were going with it, what they were doing with it. I did not have any clue of what the end goal was. And when we did get to the end goal, it was kind of that 90s fear of the future, sort of alarmism, not in a horribly negative way, but the internet is kind of a big scary thing in the show. So this is one of those examples. So this is the big one in season 1. The episode is called Powers, Principalities, Thrones, and Dominions. And this one's a whopper for what I'm referring to. We start the episode out watching, and this is a direct quote from what I wrote down. A magical emo with laser hands shoots a guy dead. And then we cut to opening credits. This is probably one of the ones that is the most frustrating to me because we don't explore what's happening in front of us. We don't explore anything beyond the fact that there was a murder and it is an investigation about a murder. We don't dig into anything else. We don't dig into why Frank sees the things the way that he sees them. We don't dig into... In fact, we start with magical emo with laser hands, and we end on a specific quote. And I went and found this quote just so that I could read it verbatim to you. Maybe he, the character in question, is part of something all of us are unaware of.
Who is he?
I don't know. Maybe he's part of something all of us are otherwise unaware of.
Mike said something like that. It made no sense to me.
And to me, that is probably one of the more frustrating lines in the show. Because it is a direct acknowledgement of the fact that we set something up that's a little bit bigger than what we want to deal with. So we're going to say, I don't know, it's something that's happening in the background that we are unaware of. And it is the strangest way to... I have no idea what to do with this episode. I have no idea how to deal with this particular concept of, I don't know, I guess it's just kind of happening in the background. This one blows my mind that this is something that the show would do. Don't think I have ever seen anything like this in any major science fiction property that I've ever encountered. Something that is sort of in a roundabout way telling you, whatever, it's fine. I don't know what to do with it. It's one of the weirdest things about this show is its just detachment from wanting to do discovery, wanting to do world building around its science fiction-y fantasy elements. And we just move right along. We just move right along. We don't tackle it. It's just something that we're unaware of. That's it. Done. Insane. So we start to wind the season down with an episode called Lamentation. And this one I'm going to have to spoil. Sorry. It is an episode where Bletcher dies. He is a major character through the first season who is a sidekick liaison at the police department, liaison type character between the FBI, the local police, and the Millennium Group, and Frank. And he gets killed by the devil. And you might be thinking to yourself, wait, is there more to that? Not really. I mean, we get introduced to this character called the Devil, who is the devil, so we can't kill them. So they reappear later in the show, which I will also be talking about their later reappearances. But it's not... They're not treated like a a series villain in the same way that you think a show like Psych. That show had the yin yang killers. I don't know how much Psych you may or may not have watched, but in that show there is a big baddie villain, and this silly sci-fi or this silly comedy show. We have a couple episodes that kind of come down in tone and do a little bit of, we're not here to make jokes, we're here to actually tell something serious. And the writers are so good at what they're doing, what they did with that show. We had this memorable arc of a serial killer that gets really close to the main characters and upsets the status quo, and it makes them memorable, and it's treated with respect, it's treated with reverence, that this is a big baddie, this isn't a crook, this isn't just a criminal, this is a big baddie, and things of the status quo in Psych change as a result of what this big baddie does. So to me it feels ham-fisted what they do with Bletcher and the Devil. And in this style that this show does, we deal with it for a couple episodes and then we move on. And Bletcher is only ever mentioned once or twice later on in the show after having been a major character. They were pretty crucial to Frank Black getting on his feet in the new town that they moved to, and then he's just gone. And it's not handled in such a way to where it feels like they thought about it. It kind of feels like, it feels kind of like an accidental plot line. And I know that's a weird thing to say, but it's so strange to me, and I don't know why they handled it with such a laissez-faire, it's such a strange thing to do. And he's, so he's gone. That's it. That's all we get of him. And, later on in the show, we have to replace him with the guy who's second command underneath of him. And so he becomes the liaison. So we killed him to replace him with someone else who does the same thing, the same way, essentially. I mean, this character feels like a subordinate of Bletcher, so I don't understand, why did we get rid of Bletcher 1 to replace him with Bletcher 2? Season 1 also has this overarching theme that spills into Season 2 of the yellow house. This yellow house imagery that sort of speaks to Frank Black's pull between the Millennium Group and his family. And it's kind of ham-fisted and doesn't really feel like it belongs anywhere. It doesn't feel like it contributes a whole lot. It's only ever explored a couple times, but I don't know, it didn't have the staying power, it didn't have the sticking power that a stronger motif would have. It's very strange. And then to end out Season 1, we end on an episode called Paper Dove. I'm not even going to explain it. It's a nothing episode. It's just throwaway. No big Season 1 ender. We do a thing, and that's it. Season 1's done. We lost Bletcher. We hopped around these weird stories that are all Monsters of the Week episodes that don't really contribute a whole lot to the story. We barely interface with what the heck the Millennium Group is the whole season. We leave the first season with a sense of, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what this season was about. I don't know what we're supposed to take from this. And as I was watching this, I was discussing this with the people around me in my real day-to-day life. And I left the first season just feeling very lost, very confused, very not sure what to make of this thing. This thing in front of me doesn't seem to stick to any motif. It doesn't seem to have a place in the ethos. It just kind of does some stuff. It can be some cool stylish stuff, but it doesn't really do a whole lot. It's just meandery, and it's unfortunate because the pieces are there, and we'll get more into that, but the pieces for a really good show are there. We jump into season 2, and the showrunners have changed. We have 2 new people at the helm, and right out of the gate, we can tell. A lot of the visual stylings have changed. The title cards with verses on them or quotes on them start to disappear in this season. The general tone starts to shift away from the darker and grittier into what I'll call X-Files light. A little more on procedural and a little less on like stylish sci-fi. In my research, there was kind of a mixed amount of sentiment on this. Some of the things that I saw were kind of positive on this because it's a little more familiar, but a lesser copy of something better, is it really better than a strange and weird, unique property? I don't know. That's something I couldn't get a clear answer on because it sort of seemed like everyone has a different opinion on this in such a way to where it's kind of polar. I personally see the value and the merit in kind of the idea of switching it up because it's kind of nice to have a little bit of familiarity with the X-Files light kind of tone, but at the same time I feel like if we would have taken that first season kind of dark and grittiness and really blasted into it full force in the second season, with the benefit of having all the characters set up and everything sort of ready to go, I don't know, I feel like it could have been interesting. But right off the bat, we have an episode where Frank Black kind of loses his cool. He's kind of tortured by this character who sends Polaroids in the mail of the family members of his wife and his child and people that are important to him, and they've been taunting him, and they're a holdover from the implied season 0 where this person is someone who's been chasing him for a while, and we really only sort of interface with him once or twice in the first season, beyond him being just a thing that's sort of happening in the background, a big baddie that doesn't necessarily get addressed until this episode directly. Frank kind of loses his cool, and he kills the bad guy. He murders him, and the repercussions of this particular action are on him and his wife, and him and Catherine up to this point have been kind of drifting apart because he spends so much time doing stuff for the Millennium Group. And the Millennium Group seems to be pulling him in a particular direction. And it's one of the little soft implications in the first season is that Frank can't find enough information out about the Millennium Group, and Peter Watts is the liaison. It's his handler, essentially. Just drip feeds him information. It's not enough to actually do anything with. And Frank starts to get fed up with this later on in season 2, which ultimately solidifies a rift between the two of them. But we'll get there. So this episode is where the family dynamic of him and his wife and his child sort of fractures. And again, like all the things in this show, it's just handled so strangely. It's a shift in the status quo, but and at least that's respected to some degree. But there isn't enough interaction between Frank and Catherine to really justify it or to really explore it. We don't do much with it. It's just kind of there. It's just a thing that, oh, they're apart now. Cool. Yeah. All right. I've seen this handled so much better in other shows that, I don't know. Like, it can't decide what it wants to do. And this episode in particular, in doing a little bit of research, the phrase overwritten was used a lot when people talked about it, because the dialogue and the scenes with the bad guy they're long and they're drawn out, and that they're in dire need of a good cut or two to bring it down to a reasonable length. It's just never done. It just keeps going and keeps going. It's kind of frustrating to watch. It's neat, it's not bad because it's overwritten. It just feels overwritten, right? It can be that way without it necessarily being wholly negative. Okay, here's another big one. This is season 2, an episode called Beware the Dog. And this is the ultimate example of why is this here? On the surface, it's a sort of X-Files-y science fiction concept. But it's used as a way to sort of frame a lore dump about the Millennium Group, which is something up to this point in the show we have been begging for. We have no clue what the Millennium Group is. We have no clue what their real motives are, what they're doing, how they're doing it. What is the Millennium Group? That is the question ending season 1 going into season 2. And this episode is supposed to give some sort of background, because we meet an old member who's sort of in this wise sage sort of archetype, and it's just nothing. It's just, we get a little background on the symbol, the Ouroboros symbol, the symbol that's used to indicate things related to the Millennium Group. Every shadowy organization has a symbol or a tagline or something to that effect. So we learn a little bit about the history, and I think that we learn, and I say I think because I don't know what the show is trying to tell me. I don't know what this lore is supposed to be about. I don't know what it's telling me. They fight evil and the dogs are the evil, but if you wish real hard, the evil goes away. Even though it can't be killed, it's always there. It's the infinite symbolism of the Ouroboros itself. And with what we learned later about the Millennium Group, okay, I don't know. I spent so much of the show confused and just trying so hard to understand what was happening. And this is one of those episodes where it's got to be important. It's got to have a message. There's a message. The show is screaming something at me, and I have no idea what it is. Unless it's all that I've described, and we spent the whole episode talking about how evil can't be killed. All right, is that it? Continuing with season 2, Sense and Anti-Sense. This is just an X-Files episode that was plopped into the Millennium universe. That's all this is. This is a leftover X-Files plot that they didn't have a place for, or it conflicted with another plot point, and they must have literally physically handed the script over to a Millennium writer and said, here, adapt it for the Millennium universe. I genuinely think that's what this is. And this isn't the only example of it, but this is like the shining prime example of, oh, the X-Files guys wrote this show. So I have another positive. It's an episode called The Mikado. Mikado, I'm not sure how that's pronounced. And it is a wonderful 90s technology time capsule that is pretty relevant to online crime and dark web things and like live leak kind of material that you can find on the internet and dark web stuff. And it's fascinating because it's a little bit of a look into it's a little bit of a look to see how technology could be used to carry out particular crimes and how things might be in the internet technology age from the viewpoint of someone in 1998. No doubt the show was written before 1998, but this feels like a time capsule. And for anyone who loves old retro technology and that sort of mid-90s aesthetic of what technology is and where it belongs in the ethos, in the media ethos, this is a fun one to watch for that. With regards to its fitting into the lore of Millennium, it's a monster of the week. It calls back to something in the past that we haven't seen before. But that's it. It's just a really cool little time capsule. So, I had a big one in season 1. And now it's time for the big one for season 2. And this two-parter, Owls and Roosters, this is another huge one for season 2. This 2-part episode is an interconflict between 2 subgroups of the Millennium Group itself. This may be one of the only in the show, I can count them on one hand, episodes where we directly interact with the Millennium Group. And we start to see what's going on behind the scenes. We get to pull back the curtain and watch what's going on. And wow, is it a mess. Wow, is it a mess. Just like all the other major things that happen in this show, it's kind of a cool idea. It's kind of a neat thing to where we have subgroups that are disagreeing on how they run the group. One wants to see it from a spiritual, religious sort of standpoint. The other one wants to go more scientific with how they deal with prophecy and how they deal with things in the coming millennium. But it's just ham-fisted and not handled well, and we've got like so many threads happening at one time, and it's not the complexity itself isn't the problem. It's that we have a cool concept that isn't necessarily fully developed and that doesn't get necessarily taken to completion. And with the action-packed intro this episode has, boy, does it peter out towards the end. And then the big bad who gets his hands on the MacGuffin, that's it. We never see him again. We never see this plot, this story again. It's never used again. It's this big, nasty weapon. We get it back in our hands, but that's it. It's done. It's over. This feels like a movie. It feels like a movie that wraps up and then you're supposed to go right to the next episode after this plot. It's frustrating because this could be a really cool concept. It could be something that is a great way to explore the lore and background and reasoning for why the Millennium Group does what it does. And for the most part, it's feels kind of ham-fisted and doesn't feel like it's really trying to say something necessarily. Another episode in season 2, 1919. This is a leftover X-Files script again. It's another one. It's another script that just belongs in the X-Files universe. This is not, this and the previous one are not the only examples of this, but it's another one of those examples that this show struggles with its identity to sort of figure out who it wants to be. So The Hand of Saint Sebastian. This is a season 2 episode that has an awesome idea. We get to dive a lot more into the lore, or what is presented as the lore for the Millennium Group. And we follow this really cool concept of, we've got this artifacty kind of thing. This episode felt like a dollar store version of a Warehouse 13 episode, and those episodes were adventure, and we had cool sci-fi stuff, but we were a retrieval unit. We were there to get the stuff and bring it back. Bag it, snag it, and tag it, as Warehouse 13 likes to say. This felt like a Warehouse 13 episode in its story, but then it just doesn't do anything. It doesn't go anywhere. Why are we searching for the hand? What's the hand gonna do for us? I don't know what it's supposed to be about. I feel like I'm saying this over and over again. I don't know what this episode's about. I don't know what the point of this episode is. I mean, is this just strictly character development for Frank Black and Peter Watts? We had to set it on the backdrop of an adventure. I mean, is that just what we do? Was that what we're doing here? And when I was making notes for this script, the on-screen appearance for the second time of CCH Pounder is what made me think of Warehouse 13. And it's a welcome sight. Trudging through the weeds of this show, trying to understand things, trying to put pieces together, trying to understand what the show is screeching at me. Seeing characters that I've seen in other properties before made it a lot more pleasant. She's a really great character, and she's a really great actor as well. So it was a welcome reprieve, as it were. The Curse of Frank Black. This is one of the standout positive episodes in this whole show. It's the one that I saw talked about in articles and in media, because it's a really cool concept, a really great execution of that concept. The use of the numbers and the symbology that carries out through the whole episode ends up being really cool and ends up being a great storytelling method. It reminds me a lot of the How I Met Your Mother episode where they have the countdown. If you're not familiar, there's an episode where they start counting down to something that you are expecting to be one thing and turns out to be something else. And it's a major shift in the episode. And this has a lot of those same sort of structures, same sort of feel to it. It's fantastic. It's one of the few episodes that I can wholly say it's great. I don't need it to be lore contributing, which it does a little bit to Frank Black's history. But again, it doesn't feel like it's there to contribute to lore. It just feels like it's just part of the episode's framework, which in this case I have no complaints about, because the episode itself is so fascinating and so interesting that it's fine. I'm happy with it. I don't know how this one's pronounced. Anemesis, Anemesis, Anamnesis. I don't know. I don't know how this one's pronounced. But this is the part in this video where I'm going to talk about Laura Means. Laura Means is introduced as another member of the Millennium Group. She is a very prominent fixture throughout Season 2. She's brought in to be a sort of secondary character to Frank. And I mean that in a very sort of positive way. They play off of each other really well. And it's a wonderful character dynamic. If it's one thing this show excels at, it's writing people. The characters, and I mean, Frank Black is written as a solid character. They don't miss a beat with him. But Laura Means is one of these characters in the show that I think they feel like they had to sacrifice her. And they do. They sacrifice her later on in the show. And it's a it's a wasted potential situation. And this episode is, in particular, dives into her and her thing with angels. To talk about Laura, we have to talk about Frank, Jordan, and Laura's gift. And the reason I haven't talked about it so far is because, damn it if the show doesn't talk about it either. Frank is introduced as having a gift.
Whoever killed him did it somewhere else, then brought him out here. It looks like he parked up on top of the road and pushed him down the hill.
I suppose you're gonna want to see the body.
No, that's okay.
Frank.
It's the same killer.
What?
He did it here. The victim was set afire here in the woods.
How far to the river?
Where he gets flashes of visions. I think it's through the point of view of the killer, but it's not always, which is why I say I think, because it's not always done that way. Sometimes he gets visions of things that aren't directly through a killer's eyes. The rules are not clear. The show doesn't really care about talking about this. It's just a thing that Frank has that we are just, it's just there. You as the viewer, he has the gift, and it's how he does the crime solve. Okay? It very much feels like that. So we come to find out later that Jordan, his daughter, also has this gift. And then we find out even later that Laura has this gift, and it's the reason that both characters were recruited into the Millennium Group in the first place, because of this gift. So it's tough to talk about the gift because the show doesn't talk about it. I mean, we barely touch on it. It's a background element. It's so tough to talk about the gift because the show doesn't talk about it. It doesn't deal with it. It doesn't dive into it. It's just a thing. It's just a thing that's there. And so the only real exploration we get of the gift is through Laura and through Jordan. Because Laura sees angels. She sees angels. And it's just kind of inexplicable. She sees angels. That's her version of the gift, right? We don't necessarily have a comparison point. Sometimes Jordan sees angels too, but Frank never sees angels. There's no rules here. It's a plot device. It's a thing that we kind of tacked on to sort of feel like we belong in the science fiction genre when we're really kind of more of a cop procedural, man helps police solve crime story, like Monk. It's closer to Monk than it is to X-Files at times, and it's so weird to make that comparison, but it's very apt. So Laura sees angels. She sees angels, and in this episode we dive into that, and this episode just kind of casually drops that heavenly creatures are real. And we just leave it. That just doesn't matter. It's just a plot point. It's just something that happens in the episode. We don't dive into why. We don't dive into what it means to everybody. We don't dive into the implication. Like, there's just heavenly things for some reason. Okay. So So Laura has the same sort of gift, but she sees angels and we get nothing. We get nothing. The show throws us nothing. And so that's this episode. Laura sees angels and we have heavenly bodies. We have heavenly creatures. Cool. Next. And so talking about Laura, she had great chemistry with Frank, and she could have been a stand-in, like, maternal figure for Jordan whenever the end of season 2 rolls around and we get the big shift, the big change. And she just succumbs to the illness at the end, the pandemic style illness at the end of the season. And she's just kind of thrown away. She even has her own line. I'm looking it up right now because I've forgotten her line. And her line is, "Here's my thing." And it's pretty neat. It's a cool little repeated idea that the show does. And looking this up right now is kind of interesting because there's just so little on this show on the internet. Nobody watched this show and very few care about it. It's so niche that finding information for this was kind of, I wouldn't say it was super difficult, but it was finding a place to stream this show and watch it was also kind of obnoxious. So Laura Means was a character that could have done a lot more. She could have been used for a lot more. She could have participated in things a lot more. She could have been something that was more important to the show, and they just didn't care. She was a casualty of the pandemic, and that was just it. The last scene we see of her, she's on a bed in a seemingly catatonic state as a result of the disease, even though the disease doesn't leave people in catatonic states, it just kills them. So that's where we leave her, and we never see her again. She may be mentioned once or twice, but where? She is never seen again, and we are on to the next one. So season 2 ends with the big shift to the status quo. We finally have something huge happen in this show, and it happens at the end of season 2. Basically, the story is the Millennium Group releases a bug that kills everyone in a particular area, and only the Millennium Group members get the antidote. Why are they releasing a deadly toxin on a small city? And then we find out later in the show that the media coverage was blown out of proportion, that it was actually just a little small town and not like the whole world as a pandemic, like they talk about it in the actual episode. It seems to be a fragment of the fact that they didn't know if they were getting a season 3, the showrunners, so this would have been how the show ended. And wow, what a shitty way to end the show, because this is the episode where they kill Catherine. Catherine makes the sacrifice to let her daughter live, to let Jordan live. She gives up the extra. So there's Frank has one antidote, and Laura gives up her antidote for either Catherine or Jordan, and ultimately Jordan is the one who gets it. So Catherine succumbs to the disease, and Laura ends up in a catatonic state somehow, and she goes out in the woods and she game ends herself, from what the show tells us. And that's it. She's gone. We have lost the wife, who is the grounding force for Frank, the thing tying him to the ground. And that grounding force shifts into being Jordan's sort of role in the show now. She's the thing that sort of keeps him grounded. The actor didn't want to leave. It wasn't a case of, oh, this is a way to write her off the show. This was the writer's choice. This was a decision that was intentionally made to contribute to the story in some way. And I don't know what they were going for. If it's just there for shock, if it's just there just to be a thing that happens, I don't know. I don't know what they're trying to do. I'm so, at this point, at the end of season 2, I'm like floundering for anything, and then we do this big status quo change, and I don't know why. I feel like I'm saying that over and over again in this video, but I don't know why. I genuinely don't know why they made the decision. I don't know what it contributes. I mean, I guess it contributes that Frank Black has to go through some more shit, because he's gone through a lot of shit in this show and is the butt end of a lot of bad things that happened to him, and there's some more. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good in a bad way like it should if we lose a big character. It feels bad in a confusing way. Like, why? What did we gain from this? Like, if you're going to kill a main character, it's usually for a reason. It's usually to drive a point home. It's usually to double down on something that's happened. And, man, I don't know. Even talking about this show stresses me out. Okay, so we start into season 3, the last season of the show, and probably the biggest tonal shift between seasons of the two big tonal shifts, because we lost some of the identity from season 1 to season 2. Now going from season 2 to season 3, we are doubling down on the police procedural FBI agent sort of X-Files light sort of feeling that I was describing. 2 episodes right in a row, The Innocents and Exegesis. This is a 2-part story, or it's a story told in 2 parts, not necessarily a 2-part story. In The Innocents, the first part, we meet a new character. We get a new character introduced to the show because we lost Laura and we lost Catherine. Now we have Emma. And the word that I saw to describe Emma was blah-tastrophe. And I like that word because it's exactly what happens with her. She gets so little character development and is sort of a checkbox on the plot of the character who is the sidekick to Frank. And it is a travesty because just like Laura, Emma is an awesome character and has a lot of potential to be a really interesting way of exploring this world. In this first episode, we have a plane crash that happens. And so Frank Black gets called in after going through months of therapy after losing his wife. He has a mental breakdown, which I don't know how in character that is for Frank. It didn't feel like it to me. But it is the loss of his wife, so maybe it is a big thing and I'm just wrong. I don't know. The show doesn't give me enough to work with to be able to say definitively, so I'm guessing. But he comes back from this intensive therapy and he's not sure if he's ready to go back out in the field, and so he goes back out into the field. He's now working with the FBI because of the large rift that has been wedged between him and the Millennium Group. And so we meet Emma in this episode, and one of the first scenes that we see her going out looking for a body that's not with the rest of the bodies that should be with the rest of the bodies, and she sees a wolf. And when we get this shot of a wolf, like, leading her out into the woods to where the body is. And my first thought was, oh, so Emma has the gift too. So she sees animals and creatures, and okay, so we're gonna get a new cool angle on the gift. No, it's just a wolf. She just follows a wolf. That's it. I try to give shows the benefit of the doubt when I watch them. I try to give them the most opportunity to surprise me, because I can be kind of cynical when it comes to media, because my standards are set pretty high for science fiction media in particular. And so whenever something lets me down like that, it sucks. It sucks a lot. So no gift for her, which is like, what a missed opportunity. That could have been really cool. We could have had her as an exploration of the gift, since we threw Laura away. No, not for me. And so in Exegesis, in part 2, we're following these women that are clones, or they're a family. It's mother and daughter to some capacity, and they have some sort of foresight where they can see into the future. It's very X-Files-y in how it's written and shown to the audience, but it's just a nothing plot that doesn't really go anywhere, and the Millennium Group gets their hands on her, and that's kind of it. That's it. It's just nothing else. Another Monster of the Week style episode that just doesn't contribute much. So, while in season 3, one of the positives that I came away with this episode called Skull and Bones, which is actually something to latch onto. It's something that I can grasp onto when thinking about and describing, and when thinking about the Millennium Group and trying to desperately reaching for some lore, for some things that will help solidify these elements in the show. And in this episode, we find that the Millennium Group has been assassinating its political opposers, its political opposition. And it's so fascinating, and it's actually explored really well, and we get to see some of the dirty laundry of the Millennium Group, and not just mentioned or implied, but we actually get to see it. We get to see the mass grave of people that were killed by the Millennium Group for one reason or another. And we get another reappearance of CCH Pounder as one of the people who died at the hands of the Millennium Group. But we learned in the previous episode she was a bad guy, so And we get another reappearance of CCH Pounder as another victim of the Millennium Group. And it's a really great story about... It's a really great way to show us what the Millennium Group actually does. It's not an implication. It's not presuming that the group does this. It's not hearsay about what the group does. We see it, and it's something that the whole show desperately needed more of. And it is the good example of where the Owls and Roosters was kind of a mess. This is the positive side of that two-sided story coin. It's a great view of direct view of what is going on, what the Millennium Group actually gets up to. Continuing into season 3, Collateral Damage, we get an episode where Frank Black puts his anger aside at the Millennium Group and Peter Watts to help Peter get his daughter back from an abductor. We're introduced to the fact that the Millennium Group has a string of victims in their wake, that we started with Skull and Bones, and this person was in the military, and they carried out orders that did some heinous action, and so he wants to get back the Millennium Group through Peter Watts' family. And so Frank Black puts his anger aside and helps Peter and the police force and the FBI get to this bad guy and talk him out. And it's a great episode. It's a great exploration of the relationship between Frank Black and Peter Watts, and it's a strained one between the two of them because of the actions of the previous season, and it's actually pretty great. It's ultimately kind of pointless, but it is a great character study. Next episode, 7 and 1. It was all in their head. It was all in their head. This character in the show was real, but it was all in their head. It's another evil. It's another evil, nebulous evil concept. 7 and 1 is so frustrating because it's an all in their head plot. It's a story about this guy who comes in and claims to be someone that wants to help, and ends up pointing the finger at Frank Black when it's not something that he did. And it ends with the threats just essentially being in the minds of the main two characters. The bad thing that's happening to Emma and the bad thing that's happening to Frank at the end of the episode, they just vanish at the end of the episode inexplicably. Okay, cool. I don't know what the point of it was. I don't know what we were trying to get at with it. It just was all in their heads, I guess. Even though Emma gets buried alive at one point, that part wasn't in her head. But seeing her double later in the episode, he's inexplicably changing shape at some point in the episode too. So like, I don't know. I don't know what the threat is, so it's hard to be afraid for the characters. One of my favorite episodes of this whole entire show is the episode in season 3 called Saturn Dreaming of Mercury. And it is an episode from the point of view of Jordan, Frank's daughter. And it is excellent. It is the kind of creativity that this show needed so desperately. We talk about the fact that Jordan has the gift, but we never do anything with it until this episode. And her gift is something that we actually explore, and we sort of start to see how she sees the world, and the episode mainly focuses on her. And it's a Frank Black and Jordan Black team up style episode, and it's a really cool exploration of how she sees the world and how she interacts with the world with her gift. There are no angels in it. You know, we forgot that was the thing that we introduced, but it's also another appearance of our devil character, the devil who killed Bletcher, but only a little bit. We mention her at the very end of the episode because she's the devil, and that's it. That's it. Anyway, this is an example of an episode of a genre of episodes for this show that could have been really, really cool. If we had enough lore and enough interest to interface with the gifts, we could have had a couple of these cool team up style episodes where Jordan helps Frank because they both have this gift, and they both could have had different viewpoints of things that they saw. And I understand Jordan's really young in the beginning of the show, but she's aging up as the show goes. So now because they lost Catherine, they have something new to potentially bond over, and The show never addresses Jordan's abilities directly up until this one episode, and then not again. Just this one episode. It's just reused over and over again as a plot device after this, where she just gets some precognition sometimes. Okay, well, we don't do anything with it, we don't explore it. She just gets to see things ahead of time sometimes, and it seems to just be for the narrative flair and not much else. So this is an episode that represents what this show could have been if it were handled in a different way. Now, in my opinion, if it were handled in a better way, but that's my opinion, if it were handled in a different way by a different set of writers who really wanted to explore this world and explore these characters more and really nail this thing down and fill in the gaps, this is one of those episodes. This remains the one that I really enjoyed a lot. It's one of the top ones because it's something that feels different. It's something that this show had the power. Only this show could have told a story like this. And it stings a lot more when you realize that lost potential ended with this show, when the show ended. It's very unfortunate. So we have 2 other episodes in season 3 that sort of follow a similar pattern in my mind. The Sound of Snow, which feels like a Fringe episode. I will talk about Fringe in the future. Don't you worry, it's one of my favorite shows of all time. But this is a Fringe episode. This just feels like something you plucked right out of that universe and dropped right into this universe. And it's fascinating to see someone else try their hand at a Fringe type story. And Fringe was heavily inspired by X-Files, so it's technically precursor, but X-Files did it better and Fringe did it better. Then we have the episode Omerta. This episode introduces healer women, and that's how the show sort of references them. They're kind of like the fictional concept, or the fictional concept that X-Files and other science fiction explore, the fairy type characters, where they're like forest dwelling, healing creatures. They're humans in this show, but they're all but dressed in green leotards with wings. They're the functional equivalent of the fairy archetype character that you see in fantasy, and it's inexplicable. They're just there. They revive a character in the show that feeds into the plot, and then there's some soft reference to them being able to revive the dead. So we have a couple scenes addressing, basically all but directly addressing the audience, that no, we're not going to bring Catherine back with these fairy women, which would have been insane if they tried. Would have been just would have been a crazy move, and I'm glad they didn't do it, because it does not tonally fit with what this show tries to do with itself. But at the same time, the show does so much strange shit that I would not be shocked if that was something that went through the writers' heads. It's very possible that that's why they mentioned it in the first place. This episode feels a lot like a Grimm episode, of all things. And again, these 2 episodes in particular, feel like they belong in a different show. That's not a compliment. If your show is lacking an identity so hard that your episodes feel like they are patchwork from other shows, that's not a good thing. And rounding out the 3rd season, before we talk about the ending of the show itself, we have an episode called Borrowed Time. And this episode is the one where Jordan almost dies. And it kind of looks like the writers were toying with the idea, which they just love to kill their main characters. So it doesn't shock me that this was an idea that went across the table. It would have wrecked any kind of semblance of continuance the story has, it would have been a horrible idea to kill off Jordan. I'm so glad they didn't. This episode seems to have some sort of moral to it, because we have this fantasy creature character that is sort of like the Grim Reaper. He's floating around the episode, showing up before people die, and it's your time now, and then, all but takes them away into the white light. And so it's Jordan's time to move on, and only at the end of the episode, when the Grim Reaper himself dies, does she survive. And at the very last minute, why did he need to die for her to live if he's a Grim Reaper character? Because he clearly has some sort of supernatural ability. He's not just a normal character. He's not just something that's... He's not just a normal guy. They're very clear with the fact that he is supernatural in some way, him appearing and disappearing like he does. So why did he say... I don't know what to do with this one, because is it because he sinks the whole train, so all of these people who weren't in the cabin that he locks at the beginning of the episode, that is airtight while the train plows into the water? What's the moral of this episode? What are we trying to... What are we being told here? I don't rightly know. So now I want to talk about a few really, really good things I love about this show. First, I want to talk about the charming 90s technology. A lot of shows, sci-fi or otherwise, tend to be time capsules of the time when they were shot, when they were written, when they aired. And this show is no exception. This show is chock full of 90s technology. Big fat CRTs, old flip phone style devices. I think there's even a car phone that shows up in a couple episodes. We get mobile phones in their earliest stages. We get lots of pre-internet jargon and lingo that is directly preceding. It's phrases like getting on the net. It's this mid-90s internet culture, mid-90s pre-internet culture, and it's so fascinating. I mentioned it when I talked about the Mikado. It's so fascinating to see. It's so interesting to watch this technology from a different era. And I personally got to experience some of this 90s technology at the later tail ends of it and into the 2000s. To see it being used in real time is fascinating. There's a scene in The Well-Worn Lock where one character asks another character if they need phone money. And I turned around after watching that scene and asked my brother, "Do you know what phone money is?" And he had no idea. He's like, "Why would you need money for a phone?" Because, I mean, it's a little before my time too, but people used to carry coins to pay at telephone booths. And it's a relic of that era. And it's fascinating to see this stuff in its moment in time, be represented on the screen like this. It's fascinating watching Frank Black interact with computers and watching how they recreate user interfaces on operating systems is endlessly fascinating to see how they do it. And everything's dial up and everything is modems and everything is, don't pick up the phone when you're on the internet. It's so cool. It's so cool to see someone try to do this shadowy organization thing with early 90s technology. It's really cool. It's one of the highlights of the show to me because I love that kind of stuff. Watching a show like Mr. Robot really respect technology as it is in reality and not falling back on silly TV tropes of, You know, we're in Mr. Robot, we actually see real operating systems that actually exist. We're seeing real hacking tools as they actually exist. It's one of those things that someone who's more technology minded like myself deeply enjoys. So I found the technology in this show particularly fascinating because of its age and because of how much the show uses technology as a part of its plot. So now I want to talk about the Josie Chung episodes. Josie Chung is a character that was introduced in X-Files that was meant to sort of take the piss out of the seriousness of X-Files. It was written as the episode where he appears and the plot story that all surrounds him is written as straight up satire of X-Files. And it is extremely funny and it is extremely pitch perfect. It is a great example of a show laughing at itself. And the Josie Chung episodes in X-Files episode is one of the top 10, maybe top 20 episodes that show has. Everybody loves the Josie Chung episodes. So I was thrilled to see in the episode descriptions that Millennium has a second Josie Chung episode and technically has a third one. So Millennium has 2 appearances of the writer Darren Morgan, who is the younger brother of Glenn Morgan, who's one of the 2 producers of season 2. Darren Morgan, in heavy makeup, plays the Fluke Man in X-Files. It's just a role that he was in. The Fluke Man doesn't have any speaking roles, so you wouldn't know who it was unless you looked into this, like I did. He also in X-Files wrote the Clive Bruckman episode, where we have an old man who can see the future, and he's reluctant, and he's an old grovelly old nasty guy who just doesn't give a shit about this, doesn't care. And so in X-Files, it's a fun episode written by Darren Morgan, and it's pitch perfect with the kind of writing Darren Morgan did for both shows. We get a Josie Chung episode where we see more of Josie Chung himself, and the whole plot revolves around him, and he's writing his next book, and instead of making fun of alien abduction things, we're making fun of Scientology things in the vein of the fact that the Millennium Group is essentially a cult in the show because, yeah, the show is so horrible at defining its own lore that has to come out like a guess. But it's like a cult. Anyway, the Josie Chung episode in this one, in Millennium, is making fun of Scientology.
Once upon a time, 2 East Indian immigrants gave birth to a baby boy whom they loved very dearly, yet nevertheless named Juggernaut Onan Gupta. Other than the name and the beard, he was a normal boy who suffered all the usual humiliations of a normal childhood. Upon graduating high school, he went off to college with the dream of someday becoming a famous neuroscientist. His goal was to be the first to comprehend how the biology of the brain gives birth to the greatest mystery of life, self-consciousness. Unfortunately, his own brain could not comprehend basic biology. He quickly switched majors to philosophy, but alas, while reading Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death, he became sick and nearly died. During recovery, though still obviously suffering from dementia, he set forth on a new dream, to become a writer. And his first forays into detective fiction proved so inept they were mistaken for brilliant parodies and finding immediate publication in the highbrow literary journal, The Dark Mask. Alongside the work of a talented group of young writers, one of whom would go on to become the leading literary light of his generation, composing profound stories in a style that made Proust seem pallid. His lovable flamboyancy made him not only a literary icon, but a cultural one as well. Why, he even made a cameo appearance in an award-winning film at Cannes.
Nobody ever comes out of there alive.
But we're here to focus on Gupta. After the demise of the magazine, Gupta could not sell his work, and he became destitute and suicidal. Out of pure desperation, he managed, in a single feverish night, to crank out a book that changed the course of human history. How to Be Happy Even When You Shouldn't. It was quickly followed by the bestsellers How to Manipulate People by Your Apparent Friendliness and How to Overcome Your Fears by Making Others Fear You. And upon the release of his masterpiece, Gupta hit the lecture hall circuit, always preaching to standing room only, for he shrewdly refrained from providing chairs.
Every painful moment in your life casts a shadow across your neurobiology. Until you exterminate these dark memories, you will remain in a negative groove. Thus, those who cannot forget their past are condemned to repeat it.
Gupta then opened an institute to help teach people how to become more self-helpful. Patients, who are called doctors, since the term patient has unhealthy associations, learn how to shed the darkness of their minds by mastering therapies taught by the Institute staff, which, to inspire a sense of empirical transmigration, is modeled after the U.S. Postal Service. The Institute proved so popular, Selfosophy branched out, and institutes popped up throughout the nation. And Gupta announced a new evolution to Selfosophy.
After wiping away its mind of darkness, the self must then wipe its eternal soul. And since our souls have existed for thousands of years before the advent of Selfosophy, we all have a great deal of wiping to do.
The tax-exempt belief system also evolved its own theology, but I can't tell you what it is. It's a secret. When learning the theology, Selfosophists must undergo a sworn blood oath ritual, which is also a secret. So this artist's depiction is purely speculative and surely way over the top. In fact, forget you even saw it. In any case, all this secrecy and profits drew criticism from some quarters, but these critics were quickly silenced, either by libel suits or by what Selfosophists call knock-knock, zoom-zoom affirmations. There were even some internal criticism. If a member continues his complaints, he is deemed a rat-thinkovich and is excommunicated from Selfosophy. In 1979, Onan Gupta molted his earthly encumbrance to pursue his self-philosophical research in another dimension. That means he died of prostate cancer. But the institution he left behind has never been more popular as we head into the next millennium. A happy, upbeat ending, if ever there was one. That is, it was, until I re-entered the story. And it's about time! You see, while conducting this research, I was contacted by a recent Rat-Thinkovich, who in one of those coincidences found only in real life and great fiction actually was named Rat-Thinkovich, Joseph P. Rat-Thinkovich, and he promised to reveal to me the never-before-disclosed secret behind Selfosophy.
And it's pitch perfect, it's sharp-witted satire, it's satire before we got too meta with it. There's a little bit of meta humor, but for the most part, it's pretty genuine in how it tells its story. And I will not spoil any of it. The episode is amazing. If you don't know anything about Millennium and you don't care about Millennium or don't care about it after you watch me talk about it for however long this video is going to be, go watch the Josie Chung episode. It's great. It's a lot of fun. So Darren Morgan for Millennium would go on to write another episode for them. Somehow Satan Got Behind Me, and it is another comedy satire episode written by Darren Morgan, and his fingerprints are all over it. It does not feature Josie Chung, but it is off the wall, goofy science fiction concepts, and I won't spoil any of it. At one point in the episode, there is a dancing devil baby that plays heavy metal music to annoy the censor.
With this, the final scene is excessively gratuitously violent. Aliens would not carry Uzis. They are an intelligent, superior race and would not carry or utilize automatic weapons. I will not approve this. I am broadcast standards and practices.
Enough words. Time for action. You bear the burden of maintaining a nation's morality on your very shoulders.
You mean?
Yes. Kill them all.
It's excellent. It's goofy. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It's one of the most fun episodes of a lot of shows. I as a result of watching more of the Josie Chung stories, as someone who hasn't spent a whole lot of time digging into X-Files things, figuring out and learning more about Darren Morgan and what he's written and his contributions to both X-Files and Millennium, I'm a fan. And if he were to go and write a whole show in the style of these Josie Chung episodes, I would watch every moment of it. So because this is written by Chris Carter, and Chris Carter also wrote X-Files, there's some allusions, there's some soft references from Millennium to X-Files, and a couple of them in no particular order. In the episode Lamentation, there's a couple character stand-ins for Mulder and Scully, who are walking in the hallway of the FBI building, and they're clearly characters cast to look like them without having the actual actors on set to shoot the scene. And I caught it naturally while I was watching. I'm like, hey, those two look a lot like, and then I scrubbed the episode back. I'm like, no, they did that on purpose. That's so goofy. And it's just a blink and you'll miss it kind of thing. But it's really clever. It's really funny. In The Time Is Now, there is a scene where we see a pack of Morleys on the floor. In my research, I discovered that this isn't the only instance of the Morley cigarettes showing up in other places. Other shows have used it. It's kind of a popular Easter egg as a soft little reference to X-Files. In the episode Human Essence, when Emma is walking down the hallway of a shady apartment building, there's just straight up audio from an episode of X-Files called Kill Switch. It's just playing loudly through the guy's speakers in his room while she's walking down the hall. It's just kind of blatant. It's just kind of there. If you had to have any loud TV show on in your dingy apartment set, it's obviously going to be X-Files. I mean, of course, right? The show feels like it ends how it starts. It feels like we ran out of episodes. The ending of this show, it's just kind of meh. It's just kind of blah. We set up earlier in the season, Emma's father has Alzheimer's, and we're getting Peter Watts showing up, offering a cure to her in exchange for her to join the Millennium Group and basically defect to the Millennium Group. And it's a struggle because she knows of Frank Black's struggle with the Millennium Group, and the pandemic arc was the Millennium Group killing his wife, and so he holds a very, very nasty grudge against the Millennium Group that is well deserved. They're tempting her to join the Millennium Group and ultimately to take over the FBI. That particular branch of the FBI is the man, one of the characters that we work with throughout the show is retiring, so she's up to take over. And so in the course of the episode, another person who may have taken charge of the FBI is basically killed by the Millennium Group to make sure that she gets the role, and ultimately she takes it and she defects to the Millennium Group and becomes another arm for them to control another major institution. And it just kind of seems to happen out of nowhere. Her principles just kind of crumble and she becomes a bad guy. And the end of the show is Frank Black pulling Jordan out of school like in the middle of the day so that they can basically run away, and then we have a episode of them sort of driving into the sunset.
Next week, we're going to take a look at something a little closer to home. In fact, your own home is what we'll be designing. Okay?
Miss Jordan.
Mr. Black. You can't just charge in here and take her.
Come on.
Mr. Black.
That's what I'm saying. It's up to us.
We're all shepherds.
Yes, honey. Yes, we are.
And then the episode ends. It's very rushed. It's very much, oh, we gotta try and tie up all these loose ends. This is our last episode. That's it. We're done. And it's very unsatisfying, and it's unfortunate because the show could have gone out in a myriad of different ways, and they just chose like the most boilerplate, boring way to do it. And so after the ending, because this was a cancellation, obviously, the X-Files writers got a chance to write a proper ending for Millennium. So there's an episode in the middle of season 7 where Mulder and Scully are investigating something that intertwines with the Millennium Group. It's a group of people resurrecting the dead, and so they're trying to resurrect a couple members of the Millennium Group who we don't know. It's not people from the show who we know. There were plenty of characters who were shown to us that were part of the Millennium Group that could have been utilized here, and they're not. Or if they are, I have no idea and I missed it. But it's just some random people that they are that this bad guy is resurrecting. So Mulder and Scully find out that it's related to the Millennium Group, and we get dropped a bombshell that the Millennium Group dissolved between the end of the show and this X-Files episode, which, I mean, the Millennium passes in this episode. 1999 becomes 2000, so I guess it makes sense, but they just kind of pull all the wind out of the sails of any kind of continuation or picking up where they left off, and usually that would be a good thing, because then the show would be over, the property would be done, you know, we would be moving on. But and inexplicably, Frank Black is in a mental institution. He checked himself into a mental institution because at the end of the show he got Jordan taken away from him because he was an unfit parent. And it's just kind of out of nowhere, and it just kind of seems to be, we put him in an institution so that we could have a reveal where, oh, and in the episode that's kind of how it goes. Where do we know that we don't know this guy? Where's he? What's he from? And we get to have a little micro lore dump while they're walking into the mental health institution. It feels like it was written narratively just for that purpose. They put him in a mental institution just so that they could have him have a lore dump while Mulder and Scully figure out who this person is. And it's just so strained. It feels like fan fiction to me. It feels like it's such a weird choice, as if there wasn't enough of that in this show. So we finally meet him in the episode, and then in the episode he doesn't want to help because if he interacts with anything related to the Millennium Group, he runs the risk of being seen as seen as the unfit parent, and he's trying to get back into good graces with whoever's keeping Jordan away from him so that he can see Jordan more often. And so he doesn't want to be involved, but he still tells Mulder indirectly what to look for, just kind of dropping him hints. And because Mulder is a god, he figures it out, and then Mulder gets himself trapped in the bad guy's house, and so then Frank Black has to come and save him. And so he comes out, he checks himself out, and he just is like, whatever, I'm gonna do the right thing, even though it could potentially harm me, which is the thing that got him in trouble throughout all the show. Nothing has been learned. So he saves Mulder. Scully shows up and saves them both because X-Files. That's how it goes. She always saves his butt. So we, in the final scene, we watch the ball drop on the year 2000. And we get some funny quips in the episode about how the millennium would technically start in 2001, not in 2000, which is just that wonderful X-Files writing. And it's not sarcastic. I mean that's a clever, funny joke. And then he gets to see Jordan on New Year's Eve, and then that's it. That's where the show ends. That's where the Millennium property finally finishes. Now, in my research, I found that there is a comic from 2015, which I'm not going to dive into here. But apparently the story continues to some degree, and they're estranged again. And then Jordan joins the Millennium group, but she's got, like, magical powers. She's got, like, telekinesis or something. It's wild. As if the show itself wasn't wild. This companion comic is, I don't know if it's canon, but the real problem with the ending of the show is that when the Millennium happened in 2000, when it happened, the Millennium Group doesn't exist anymore, or it doesn't have a reason to exist, because that's its whole shtick. The whole shtick is that the Millennium Group is worried about the end of the Millennium, and we end up figuring out that it's essentially a doomsday cult related to the Millennium. So now that that's passed, they're short of doing some sort of wonky year 3000 Millennium cult, which would be a very strange story to pick up on. There's really nothing for the show to latch onto anymore. And it's a real travesty, because it's a lot of lost potential. It's a lot of missed potential. It's a lot of things that could have been cool that just weren't. It really feels like this show is a hodgepodge of rejected X-Files scripts, half-baked arcs, and an outright refusal to flesh anything out. I keep watching, hoping it will pick up in the next episode, and it ultimately never does. I really want to love it. I like genuinely do, and there's some serious fans of this show and people who look back on it fondly. But in my mind, Millennium is to X-Files what Eureka was to Warehouse 13. Eureka really tried. Boy, did they try. But they had a power scaling problem, they had a plot problem, they had a character problem. That show's a mess. Versus Warehouse 13, which was rock solid. That show is so good. It really does feel like a similar dynamic to those two shows, where Millennium could have been something of its own, and it never materialized. It never happened. And it's very unfortunate, because there was a lot of potential, and most of it was missed out on, and most of it was squandered and thrown away, and for seemingly strange reasons. And I genuinely don't know what they were trying to do. It's a very frustrating show to watch.